Welcome back. The 21st of August 1929 marked the wedding day of two lovers. He was 42, she was about half his age. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera would become two of Mexico's most famous people, not only because they were talented artists, but also because of their incredibly stormy and passionate relationship. An exhibition of their work is now on at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, but what we're particularly interested in this evening is that relationship and some of their historic connections. Gerry Mullins is here to talk to us about Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo and the people around them, and the, as I said at the beginning, inevitable Irish connection. We'll come to that later. Tell us about Frida Kahlo, first of all, Gerry. Born in 1907, developed polio as a young girl. She suffered lifelong health problems. Lifelong.
It doesn't come much worse. And at the same time, she also had great attributes, which of course kept her going throughout her life as well. She was born to a German dad, a traditional Mexican mum. She grew up in a relatively well-off house, relatively middle class. And she showed promise. She was hoping to do a medical degree later on, but around about the age of 17, 18, that kind of time, she was involved in a terrible crash between a tram and a bus, and without going too much into the details, one of the tram tracks pierced one part of her body and came out another part of her body, which left her in a fairly bad situation for a year anyway. She was more or less confined to bed for a year.
Welcome back. The 21st of August 1929 marked the wedding day of two lovers. He was 42, she was about half his age. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera would become two of Mexico's most famous people, not only because they were talented artists, but also because of their incredibly stormy and passionate relationship. An exhibition of their work is now on at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, but what we're particularly interested in this evening is that relationship and some of their historic connections. Gerry Mullins is here to talk to us about Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo and the people around them, and the, as I said at the beginning, inevitable Irish connection. We'll come to that later. Tell us about Frida Kahlo, first of all, Gerry. Born in 1907, developed polio as a young girl. She suffered lifelong health problems.
Lifelong. It doesn't come much worse. And at the same time, she also had great attributes, which of course kept her going throughout her life as well. She was born to a German dad, a traditional Mexican mum. She grew up in a relatively well-off house, relatively middle class. And she showed promise. She was hoping to do a medical degree later on, but around about the age of 17, 18, that kind of time, she was involved in a terrible crash between a tram and a bus, and without going too much into the details, one of the tram tracks pierced one part of her body and came out another part of her body, which left her in a fairly bad situation for a year anyway. She was more or less confined to bed for a year, but also meant that she wasn't able to have children later on in life, which I think kind of informed a lot of her pain and a lot of her art later on in life.
And died very young, died at the age of 44.
Yes, yes. But along the way, she was a very good-looking lady. And she was very vivacious, very intelligent, sharp, witted, self-aware. So she had on one side this injury that she tried to keep well hidden underneath long flowing traditional Mexican dresses. And on the other side, she was well able to catch and command the attention of men. And she did that with Diego Rivera. Of course, catching any woman trying to catch Diego's attention
wasn't that difficult.
No.
She did. She had an amputation though at some point as well.
Well, that was towards the end, towards the very, very end. But she had a fair bit of pain in between abortions and miscarriages, that sort of thing. She also had scoliosis of the spine. She had a touch of epilepsy, a little bit of polio, as we mentioned earlier on. So she kind of had quite a catalogue of illnesses before the amputation, which happened in her 40s.
That was her leg.
Yes,
one of her legs amputated. Now, Diego Rivera, notorious womanizer, to put it mildly.
Yes. Well, he was one of the greatest artists of his time. He showed great promise as a young man in Mexico, came and studied in Europe, in France and in Italy, was a contemporary of our friend the Cubist.
Picasso.
Picasso and various other big names. So by the time he got back to Mexico later on in life in his 30s, he was actually famous. It's hard to think of a modern artist like him. I would say it might be easier to compare him to rock and roll stars, you know. I think of more of like a Mick Jagger type of person. He was rich, he was making a lot of money from his art. He was very, very well known. He had power up and down the social ladder in Mexico, right to the very top with the president, and yet regarded himself, he was very strong in communism. communism, so regarded himself as being very close to the workers, and a lot of his art depicts this. So between Diego and Frida, you have this, you have two big personalities who met, and when they met, they gave off sparks.
It was kind of Taylor and Burton, wasn't it, in a way?
Yes,
in fact, they married twice.
They married twice. You are right. You're right. So they were both. He obviously was famous. She not so. And for most of her life, she was in his shadow. But nowadays, her art eclipses his. You know, so if you happen to have a Frida painting on your wall and a Diego painting on your wall, you're rich either way. But the Frida one is probably worth more.
I think Fintan O'Toole put it very well in the Irish Times yesterday when he said she used to be the wife of Diego Rivera. He's now Frida Kahlo's husband.
Well, that's an intro. I didn't see that comment, but yes, I think he's on the money there.
They were both communists, and she ended up having an affair with Leon Trotsky. How did that come about?
Well, I suppose where do you start with this? I mean, you can go back to the time that they got married. They got married in 1929. Right. And as you said earlier on, he was in his 40s, she was in her 20s. Very much in his shadow in a variety of ways, physically as well as in the public the public domain. But he made it clear from the very beginning. He reckoned that he was physiologically incapable of being faithful. She was his third wife, so he had plenty of reason to believe this particular...
and so did his previous wife.
So his previous wife, exactly. But he apparently had a note from his doctor. You know, like us who used to miss days in school, we have a note from our doctor. He had a note from his doctor.
So it was like a prescription.
Like a prescription, yes. Explaining his behaviour, but also, I suppose, justifying it. So from the word go, she understood what she was literally getting into bed with, and it was never going to be a conventional marriage. I think she turned a blind eye for quite a while, and in fact there's evidence to suggest she kind of had her own little... celebrations on the side as well. But I think the line was crossed when he had an affair with her younger sister. And that was kind of the moment at which he kind of went past a point of no forgiveness. So they split up, but around about 1937, if we now would talk about the Trotskys for a moment. The poor old Trotskys had a terrible time. Leon Trotsky had been one of the most powerful men in the world. He had created and led the Red Army. So he had 5 million men under his control at one stage. 5 million. But he got on. There was after the demise of Lenin, there was two men going for the main job, Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin got the gold medal and then started to
Trotsky did not get the silver medal.
No, he didn't.
He didn't get a medal at all.
No. So he got squeezed out of the Communist Party. He then got squeezed out of Russia. Now, Trotsky, I think in later life, Stalin would have just bumped him off, but he was a bit slow in this particular case. The Mr. and Mrs. Trotsky got deported to Turkey and later on to Paris. And during this time, they had 3 children. All 3 of them were murdered by Stalin. And during this time, the first one was found in mysterious circumstances in Berlin. Everywhere they went, they weren't sure if they themselves would be assassinated, but they were certainly certain that everywhere they went, the government was under pressure from Stalin to push them on, move them somewhere else. So they got moved up to Norway, where they enjoyed a few years of peace, but never knew when the gunman was to show up. And eventually, the Norwegian government was under pressure to get rid of them. Nobody knew where they'd end up. Diego Rivera petitioned the Mexican president, and he managed to get him get the Trotskys brought to Mexico on an oil tanker.
Which was a fairly courageous thing to do, because presumably you could become collateral damage if Stalin decided now is the time I'm going to go for the Trotskys.
Absolutely,
because they actually stayed in the house
Diego Rivera's house.
Yeah.
And well, brave is one way, but Diego, of course, was so proud. I mean, an artist to be, he was a communist, and he was now in the middle of this whole communist story, and he had Trotskys living in his house. And you are right, though, the danger of becoming collateral damage was quite a possibility. But at this point, Frida kind of patched it up with Diego just to keep things going for this particular visit, which lasted 2 years. And around about this time, she and Leon Trotsky had a bit of a fling. And why did it happen? I would say for a variety of reasons. And one of them was that Diego crossed the line by having an affair with her sister, and this was the perfect retaliation. And it's very sad when you think of poor Mrs. Trotsky. even when you say Mrs. Trotsky, it sounds daft, doesn't it? Natalia Trotsky. I always think, when a spouse is caught cheating, there's always these kind of, after all I did for him kind of speeches. After all I did for her, I put her through college, or I paid off her loans or whatever. Well, Mrs. Trotsky had her 3 children murdered. She had kind of lived on the run for more than a decade at this stage. She had gone from being a very, very powerful lady in Moscow, where her husband was in charge of 5 million men, to now she was living as a person, a fugitive. And still, after all she did for him, there was
more to come.
There's more to come.
Okay, there's an Irish connection, and we'll come back to the Trotskys, because the Irish connection feeds in a sense to the to the Trotskys, or to the end of Leon Trotsky in particular. What was the Irish connection?
Well, the Irish connection comes in the form of Albert Bender, who was an Irish Jew living in San Francisco. He grew up in Dublin. His dad was a rabbi here in Dublin, and in his teens he moved out to San Francisco, where he did well in the world of insurance. Presumably became a millionaire. Nothing super, wasn't a billionaire, but he never married, and instead he poured his wealth into the arts, and he became the biggest buyer and donor of art in California during the first half of the 20th century.
And he got Rivera into the United States.
Because Rivera couldn't get into the US. Rivera, as I said, was world famous, and there was big commissions waiting for him in the United States, but he was a commie, and they didn't want no commies in the United States. But Bender pulled a few strings, and he managed to get Diego and Frida into the United States, where Diego then was able to take up a big commission.
Into San Francisco, where they don't worry about commies.
Well, you have to have a shade of pink before you're accepted, you know.
He did a lot of these famous mural commissions, socialistic mural commissions, and in fact, they survive to this day, and the influence of Rivera survives in places like Coit Tower, for example. He didn't do the murals there, but people who were influenced, or school of Rivera, did. Yes. So he made an impact.
Oh, complete impact. Again, I don't think there's a modern day artist to compare with them, but when Diego Rivera came to town, people queued up to watch him work. Another exhibition that Bender organised from in 1940 out in Treasure Island, which is an island in the bay between Oakland and San Francisco. Thousands and thousands of people queued up to watch Diego Rivera paint, you know. Let me just give you the Irish, just to take it up to modern day for a moment. We have obviously in the IMA, you have this exhibition opening of Diego and Frida. Down in the National Museum in Collins Barracks, there is an exhibition that Albert Bender set up with Adolf Marr. That's the man who was director of the National Museum, who I spoke about here a couple of months ago with his Nazi connections. So for the first time, well, the only time in the history of this city, we have the spirits of Diego, Frida and Albert Bender in the one city.
Albert Bender stuff, that's Asian art.
That's Asian art.
Which is in the
but you can actually, it's about a 20-minute walk between the two exhibitions.
To bring finally Bender and Trotsky and Diego and Frida together, 1940, Ramon Mercader, with an ice pick, kills Trotsky.
Yes.
How do Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, and in a sense Albert Bender, get dragged into this?
Well, Diego, first of all, about a month and a half before the actual successful assassination attempt, there had been an unsuccessful one. And the bedroom of the Trotskys had been machine gunned. And because everybody knew about the affair, everybody knew there was a falling out between the two men. So Diego had hightailed to the United States anyway. He was helped out of the country by Paulette Goddard, that's Charlie Chaplin's wife, who he was having an affair with. So
Of course
he was. So he'd already he'd gone on the run, he'd managed to get out of Mexico and got up to San Francisco, where Albert Bender had arranged work for him. Frida was arrested, and she was in prison for a couple of days, and it was just suspected that the two of them together had bumped off Trotsky, which wasn't the case. But when the phone call came through from Frida to Diego in San Francisco, he was actually with Albert Bender, and she screamed down the phone at him, stupido, you're stupid, you're the one, you got him killed, you know. And of course they're blaming each other, and of course Diego was running around the hotel room in San Francisco with his hands in the air saying, I'm next. He was quite sure that Stalin was going to come and get him.
I don't know if you can answer this question finally. I certainly can't. Is Barbara Kingsolver's book The Lacuna based on them?
I haven't read it, but I think so. It's a novel that only came out a few years ago, and I think it touches on them. Yes, okay, I think it does.
So
yes.
They feature in it. Fascinating story. You can see the exhibition. You can go to the National Museum of Collins Barracks. You can see the Bender collection. You can see Diego, Frida, and their paintings at the museum, the Irish Museum of Modern Art. They're only 20 minutes apart.
It's a great walk.
So you could actually, nice
walk. Five are in for Diego and Frida, and free into the one in Collins Barracks.
Gerry, thank you very, very much indeed for that. That's Gerry Mullins on Kahlo and on Rivera and on Trotsky, and don't forget Bender.